with a sermon, one I preached before, right? And one time I came here and I shared from a Bible study I had done through the life of Barnabas. I'm not sure if any of you were here at that time. And today I want to share a little about a Bible study too, and so this is going to be a little more interactive than maybe you're used to. I'm not sure how interactive these things usually are. But I really want to focus on relationships. And I want to look at one particular triangle in the Bible. Three different relationships and two different events. And I want to look at them with an eye to what is really going on there and what's the underlying message about relationships and what it looks like to honor God and honor people. And so this is not going to be like a regular message where I've got points and you can write it down. It's not going to be that easy for you. It's going to be a lot more work for us because we're going to really get down into the gritty. And one thing that I have enjoyed doing more as I've gotten older is when I read biblical stories, and a lot of this comes from being a pastor for 29 years and doing a lot of counseling and soul care with people and really getting into their stories and their lives, is now when I read stories, I don't read them the same. I read them and I suddenly see and recognize all the people at Oasis and all the other people that have come to the Oasis and all the other people, Christians and non-Christians I've dealt with over the years. I begin to see them in the story. And the stories take on so much more color and depth the longer we live. I notice most of the people in this room are probably over the age of 40. I had a friend years ago who said no one should write a book before they're 40 because they have no life experience before then. And I preached differently after I turned 40, which was 12 years ago, because of life experience. So when we go into these two passages, I want us to really look at them as this is what's happening in your home and in each other's homes and your next door neighbors. And this is really what goes on. So, two passages I want us to look at. The first, they're both in Genesis. We're going way back. One is in Genesis chapter 16. And it's the entire chapter. And the other one is in part of chapter 21. And can you guess who we're going to talk about? Well, Abraham's one of them. He's one of the three. He's part of the triangle. That's 1/3 of the triangle. You can look at it from 16 and probably figure it out. Sarah and Hagar are the other two. I don't know about you, but I have slaves and concubines. No, I don't. But, we look at the story and we see slaves and concubines and we think, oh, wow, that's nothing like our lives today. I want you to think differently about the story when we get into it. Okay, so chapter 16, then we'll flip over to 21. And I'm going to read Sarah's name, Sarai, as Sarah. And I'm going to call her Sarah this whole time, even though her name doesn't change until chapter 17. And I'm going to call Abram Abraham while I talk today, even though in one chapter he's Abram and one is Abraham. Now, Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarah said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarah mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarah," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord, told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, You are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Chapter 21, beginning in verse 8. Isaac grew and was weaned. And on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, Do not be so distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down nearby, about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there nearby, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. Let's pray. Father, I pray that you would help us to get real insight today from the relationships between Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. And to realize where we see ourselves in this story and the ways that we deal with conflict, the ways we do relationship, and that we would recognize that the invitation for these people is the same invitation for us. And Father, I pray that unlike these three people, we would respond to you with soft hearts. That we would choose to honor you and the people around us. That we would choose love. That we would choose submission. That we would choose obedience. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I think if I summed up this story, the two stories together, it would be that when we refuse to obey God by resolving relationships God's way, when we refuse to honor God by resolving conflict in a way that honors God and others, it has catastrophic consequences. It really does. And this story is a great picture of that. I want you to think about the different ways we respond to conflict. I think one of the ways we tend to respond to conflict, and you've done all three of these, okay, but you have a favorite. Okay, we all have favorites. We have every tool in our chest, but some of our are our favorite tools. Some of us, we fight when there's conflict. We fight. And you know who you are. You get big. This is something I've noticed in me in my life. We get big. We take over. We get loud. we are going to be heard. Some people choose flight, like we get out of the Dodge, people turn around, we're not even there, the door's just swinging, and you can hear the car and the wheels screech, right? Some of us, we go to our bedroom, we leave the house, we shut down. You know, sometimes flight doesn't look like running, it looks like staying present, but the lights are on and nobody's home. Some of us just shut down. We're not emotionally present anymore. And then some of us just avoid the conflict like the plague. We just avoid it, and we look for a way around it, and we pretend things are fine when they aren't, and we're always smiling, and every day is good, and everything is wonderful, and we're just passive. Do you see those in the story? Who fights in the story? Who's the fighter? Who's the attacker in the story? Sarah. Oh man, Sarah. You better get out of her way. You better get out of Sarah's way. Some of you identify with Sarah. Who's the runner? Hagar. She's literally a runaway in the story. And it makes sense when you understand her story in a moment. But Abram, how does he respond? It's all good. It's all wonderful. What a wonderful house. I have the most beautiful family. My family's so wonderful until he has no family. Till he loses it. Abram is the classic passive denier. Here's my slave, okay. Hey, she's despising me, okay. Hey, he's mocking, okay. What does he do? Nothing. And that's some of us. So some of you identify with Abraham. Your basic response to conflict is what conflict? And you have all of these in your home. Because regardless of which one you choose, the other people in your house pick one. Now sometimes you can have two people to pick the same. That can be super contentious, all right? So what typically happens in the home is we choose different styles because that is complementary. And people say, well, we have a marriage made in heaven. Well, you may have a marriage made in heaven, but it's more likely that you have a marriage where everybody's sin pattern is compatible with all the other sin patterns in the home. That's probably what's actually happening in most homes. And there's less conflict simply because people respond differently and not identically to the situation. So I want to look at each person and how they handle conflict and what we see here. And I want you to see yourselves here. If you're sitting next to someone you love, you might be tempted to, elbow them. But don't do that, even though you will see them more easily than you see yourself. So let's look at Sarah. So look at the facts. So Sarah is in her early 70s. Commentators think she's somewhere between the ages of 72 and 75, at least in the first story. She's very wealthy. She may be the wealthiest person that she knows. And in those days, wealth means power. And so Sarah's very powerful. She has a lot of power. Power that she abuses, but she has a lot of power. Even though she's a female in the story, she's a unique female. Sarah is a woman with a voice, which is rare, with money and power. But she has a problem. What's her problem? Her life's not perfect. What's her problem? She's infertile. Now, infertility, it has always been a problem. It's always been a problem. Even today, there's sometimes a little bit of shame that people experience with infertility. But the amount of shame we feel, it's probably just a small dose compared to what they experienced in those days. A woman was often seen as her worth was tied to her ability to give her husband sons. So there's this deep disappointment in Sarah that's underneath the story that you don't see. So you have to take what you know about people, and you have to see these people with depth. Here's a woman who has a great disappointment in her life. She can't have kids. And she's been through menopause. So everything she knows tells her what? I'll never have children. It's too late for me. So here's a woman that has so much. and yet she lacks so much. And so she looks like a proud woman, but inside she's a pretty empty woman. Because not only does she have disappointment, she walks with shame. She lives with shame. And most of us do. Most of us live with a lot of shame. And we have this shame attendant on our shoulders that's constantly telling us who we are, and it's not who Jesus says we are. And you've got Sarah who's walking around wondering what everybody around her thinks of her because she cannot give her the one thing her husband wants in this world. She can't give him the one thing he wants. The one thing he pled out to God when God first came to him was, you love me? Really? You're my protector? You're my shield? There's only one thing I want, God. I want a son. Sarah can't give that to her husband. So here's a woman that's walking around like a lot of us, feeling like a big disappointment to the people in her lives. Right? She feels like a disappointment to her husband. Oh, he hasn't said anything. Okay. Does he have to? He's probably a very kind husband. But what she hears underneath his comments, you're a huge disappointment. And she's not just a disappointment to her husband, she must be a disappointment to God because God won't open her womb and he has that power. So Sarah probably feels like a failure. If only I had loved God better, maybe he would have given me a son. She's an embarrassing failure. And now think about how she interacts with people when she sees women, even slaves in her home, holding their children. What are the feelings she has? How do you think she feels when she sees the slave women in her home, holding children? You can interact with me, it's allowed. Jealous. She probably doesn't come out and say it, but there's a jealousy, there's a sting, maybe even a bitterness. How is it that God opened her womb, but he won't open mine? There's frustration and anxiety over her infertility. She can't make herself fertile. If she lived today, she would have been to every single doctor, every single clinic, explored every single option, and she would have heard for the 15th time, there's nothing we can do for you. Frustration. She's probably a little enraged at God. She's probably not aware of it. It's probably something she tucks down. But there's this demand on God. God, you owe me. Why? Yeah. And certainly the demanding at God is going to come out with Abraham. It's going to come out with Abraham. He's God with skin on. Right? He's there. He's available. We often take out our anxiety and our frustration and our anger on the people closest to us, whether or not they are the direct recipient of our anger. So, she's like all of us. She has a steadfast determination to remain independent and make life work apart from God, because that's the nature of fallen mankind. I will remain independent and I will make my life work apart from God. And so she cannot make a child, but what can she do?
Substitute.
It's culturally acceptable. There are no laws against it. In fact, there's actually a cultural expectation among the people around her that this is exactly how you solve that problem. She might have even heard from more than one person, well, why haven't you given one of your slaves to your husband? That's what we do. I mean, everybody else does it. We know that because we've got all kind of information from that time period, and that is common. And there's no Mosaic law. There's no law against it. It's a cultural expectation that you allow a slave to be promoted to concubine. By the way, in the world of slavery, that's a promotion. To give a child to your husband. And then you would legally adopt that child as yours. It's not reckoned as that woman's child. It's reckoned as your child. It's a legal adoption. So, she's going to rely on her own resources because that's what we do. We rely on our resources. We don't go to the God of heaven and say, God, what do you want to do here? We take matters into our own hands. We reach in our pocket and there's always a nickel. There's always a nickel. I have something I can give. The reality is, she bears the image of God, and she's a gift to her husband and to everyone in her life. And that is how God sees her, but that is not how Sarah sees Sarah. The way we see ourselves is not the way God sees us. So what's her mistake? Well, let's talk about her failures. Okay, there's a bunch of them, and you can help me with these. What are some of the failures you see in these two scenes with Sarah? What are some of the things she clearly did outside the boundaries of what it looks like to handle conflict in a godly way?
Did she have a dialogue with her husband?
We don't see a dialogue so much as, I need you to do this.
No discussion.
No discussion. Not much of a discussion. This discussion is a real short discussion, isn't it? It's mostly her talking and Abraham saying yes, yes, yes. That's the pattern in their marriage. Yes,
yes, dear?
Yes, yes, dear. That's the marriage pattern, probably. Yeah. When did she consult God in the story?
Not at all.
Not at all. In fact, who consulted God in the story? Wow, nobody. Instead of consulting God, she, here's the language in Hebrew, took her slave and gave her to her husband. Where do you see that language in Genesis? Took some and gave it to her husband. Genesis 3. Same language as Genesis 3. That should give us like goosebumps. We're seeing Adam and Eve all over again. And then she starts taking out her anger where? Hagar. Yeah, the word for abuse or mistreat, depending on your translation, is a word that implies physical and psychological abuse. Initially, she's friendly to Hagar. She gives her a promotion. She's a concubine. She gets pregnant, and then we're going to talk about Hagar in a minute. She despises her mistress. The mistress gets mad. She says, "Your concubine is despising me." And Abram says, "She's yours then." Now that's a demotion. She's back to slave. And now Sarah can do with Hagar whatever she wants, and she does whatever she wants. We often pick on whoever around us has less power than we do. And that was Hagar. She becomes the object of Sarah's jealousy and anger. This is our story, guys. This is what happens in every home. You may not have slaves and concubines, but who are the powerless people in your home? Our kids, our grandkids. Sarah had some legitimate longings to be seen, to be noticed, to have a child. She doesn't take any of these to God. She doesn't even tell her husband how she's feeling. She just makes a case against Abraham and against Hagar. She just builds a case against them. We do that, don't we? Yeah. Yeah. And don't we do that? I mean, I've noticed in my life recently, having some conversations with some people, and we had kind of a falling out, and then we had more discussions to try to resolve the conflict in a godly way, and we did. But over the course of that, I realized people really do build cases against other people. The moment you decide someone has hurt you, you start building a case. And sometimes you build a case for weeks, and sometimes months, and sometimes years. We build a case in secret against the other person to protect us, and we turn them into villains. We all wear gray hats, but we like to think that we wear a white hat and everybody else has a black hat. Anyone hurting us has a black hat. The reality is, it's not that simple, but we try to make it that simple, don't we? It's easier to live with that kind of simplicity, and so we build a case. And so did she. She built a case. And she built such a case that she becomes a victim. she looks to Abraham and says, your concubine is doing this to me. Whoa, whoa. Whose idea was this? What does Sarah own? Have you ever been that way? It's everybody else's fault. This is Abraham's fault, and this is Hagar's fault. That slave girl has the audacity. This is your concubine. Sarah has no part in this? She's a helpless victim? Don't we make ourselves out to be helpless victims, and it's everybody else's fault but mine? She owns nothing. And then there's Ishmael, her legally adopted son, her stepson. She's about to tell her husband in chapter 21, get rid of him. Well, he's mocking his little brother. What do you think Ishmael's feeling when he's at the weaning ceremony for Isaac? What do you think's going on inside of Ishmael? Be Ishmael for a minute. Ishmael's about 14, 15, 16, maybe as old as 17. Isaac's about 2 or 3. He's being weaned. There's a big ceremony. What's going on inside of Ishmael? Envy. Why? I think this one's dad's favorite. I'm not sure, but I think I'm being replaced. Do you think Ishmael's experiencing some of that? He's been raised thinking, he's a teenager. Sarah's his mom. Now you've seen this with families that are blended, right? It seems like mom is showing a certain level of affection to Isaac I don't remember ever getting from him. Do you see that? I see it all the time in Stephanie. I don't know how many times I've heard kids in blended families tell me, I feel like she's dad's favorite, and dad treats her in a way he never treated me. So, how much time does Sarah take to get inside of what's going on inside of Ishmael? No, she doesn't try to understand him. So she's harsh and unjust. She's depersonalized Hagar, and she's depersonalized Ishmael, because when she says get rid of them, she says get rid of that woman and her son. You know they have names. But Sarah doesn't use the names. Because to make it easier to do what she's doing, she's found a way to depersonalize them. That woman and her son. Oh, you mean your legally adopted son? You mean your son? Your stepson? Is that what you're talking about? You're talking about Ishmael? God's invitation, I think, for her is to grieve. To grieve the infertility, the disappointment that comes with it, and the shame. To tell her husband how she feels. To recognize how her story impacts her. I want you to think about this. This is a really important takeaway for me of this story. I think every single person in the story needs to grieve, and I think every person in the story needs to realize how their story impacts them. We don't take enough time to tell our stories with each other and realize how our story impacts us. Do you remember there was a story where Abraham goes down to Egypt? And he becomes fearful that Pharaoh is going to kill him in order to get what? His wife. So he comes to Sarah and he tells her, I need for you to pretend to be my sister and marry Pharaoh. How much room did he give Sarah to refuse? I want you to think about this. Sarah had no right of refusal. Her boundaries, okay, I'm going to use modern language now. Her boundaries were completely ignored. She did what she was told. When somebody's boundaries are not honored, we call that enmeshed. And you know families like this. You may be in a family like this. Enmeshed families are where people's boundaries are not honored and they're treated as an extension of the primary people in the family. You're here as an extension of mom or dad or both. You don't have any boundaries. We can ignore them at will. What do we do to people when we treat them like they don't have boundaries? Well, in this case, you set up Sarah to treat someone else like they don't have boundaries either. When she takes and gives Hagar to her husband, do you think there's ever a conversation with Hagar? Hey, what do you think? I know you're a teenager, and I know my husband's 85 years old, and he's kind of a gross old man, but would you like to sleep with him and have a child with him? Do you think that conversation happened? She was forced into surrogacy. You know what we call that today? Rape. We call it rape. How is it that Sarah is willing to treat this human being as an object? Well, maybe she was treated like an object. And the victim becomes the accuser. Do you think Abraham owns some of that? By ignoring the boundaries of Sarah earlier, did he not set up Sarah to ignore the boundaries of her maidservant later? There's so much going on here, right? There's a lot of complexity here. Let's move over to Hagar. She's an outcast. She's not from the family. She's a foreigner. She's also a slave. She'll get promoted to concubine, which is a better slave, but then she gets demoted again to just regular slave. She's forced into surrogacy, so we would say today that Hagar is a teenage rape victim. That's what we would say today. I read one commentator that said, Herman Gunkel said, it would have been an honor for her to be sexually intimate with her master. Really, Herman Gunkel? And how do you know that? Right? I get furious sometimes when I read what people say. It was an honor. It was an honor? How? She had no power and no voice. Some of you may feel that way. Some of you may have at one point, well, all of you were children, so all of you have been there. You've all had no power, no voice at some time. And there are people around you that have no power, no voice. There are others that do, but don't think they do. Because we often, when we get to the point in our lives where we do have power and do have a voice, we don't recognize it. Because we live so long without one. I'm dealing with people in my own life right now who are just now realizing, wow, I've had power. I've had a voice for a long time. I keep thinking I'm still one of 11 children growing up that was sexually abused. I'm not that person anymore. I actually do have a voice today. Hagar. She saw herself as merely an extension of Abraham and Sarah. She was enmeshed. She had no boundaries. Nobody asked her what she thought, how she felt. Most likely, from what we know today, she would have experienced some form of depression. She would have been truly powerless. But what do we learn about her from this story? What is the truth about Hagar? God made her in his image, and what do we know about her from this story from God's point of view? How does she name God? She comes up with a name for God.
Well, she's not invisible because God sees her.
God sees her. And for some of us, that's what we need to know, is that God sees me. She felt like she didn't matter. She was merely an object to fulfill the desires and longings and needs of other people around her. And the God of heaven says, Hagar, I see you as a person. It's interesting. Her son's going to get a similar message. I hear you. I hear you. Her failure, well, after becoming pregnant, this powerless woman got a taste of power for just one moment. And it felt really good. And she saw Sarah the way Sarah saw Sarah. And apparently nobody called her out on it. So it resulted in her immediate demotion. She also ran away, which I don't blame her for, honestly. I think any of us in the same situation would run away. But the God of heaven said, I need you to go back. I need you to not run. Now, I do tell people to leave abuse. I always do as a pastor. I always say, get out of abusive situations. But this is a unique situation where God actually said, because of my plan for the world, I need you to go back. Her invitation, I think, is to grieve the loss of identity, family, future, safety, comfort. That would have given her such compassion for her mistress. The compassion she lacked. She would have been able to forgive the wrong done to her too, I suspect. And if she had only recognized how her story impacted her, I mean, think about her story, and if she had only appreciated her story, maybe she wouldn't have been so quick to despise someone else. And then there's Abraham. The consequences already are pretty dire, right? He's going to lose his son. Hagar and Ishmael are going to lose their family and start over. Ishmael and his descendants are going to become wild donkeys, which basically means untrainable, wild, belligerent, unwilling to submit to any kind of authority. Well, can you blame someone who has been powerless, whose father has rejected them, who've experienced oppression? Can you blame that people group from basically saying, nobody will tell me what to do? No, you see that in our culture? The result of oppression and rejection is, no one will tell me anything. We don't get there by accident, folks. Abraham was wealthy and powerful, but childless. No doubt disappointed. Clearly desires with everything in his being to avoid conflict. His image is probably, I don't have what it takes to make a boy. I can't make a son. I'm incompetent. I'm weak. I'm not a real man. And yet God must see him as a warrior. And it's too bad that Abraham doesn't see himself the way God does, because if he realized he had what it takes, he could walk toward all of the people in his life with strength, which is the one thing he refuses to do. He chooses passivity probably because he doesn't really think he has what it takes. He'll just make a bigger mess. That's what we tell ourselves, right? I'll just make a bigger mess. I don't know how to handle the sword. I'll just cut off all the wrong heads. It's better off if I leave my sword in the corner. That was Abraham. Everybody's better off if I don't get involved. Really? Actually, nobody's better off because Abraham doesn't get involved. Abraham refused to protect the women in his life, and he left them vulnerable and defenseless. He didn't protect Sarah, he didn't protect Hagar, and eventually he refused to protect even Ishmael. That's a sorry excuse for manhood. Instead of consulting the God of heaven, what would you have us do? He passively submits to his wife and sleeps with Hagar. This is the sin of Adam, right? We'll just do what we're told. It's just easier that way. It's just less painful. It's less messy if I just do what I'm told. So he lets Hagar show disrespect for Sarah. He doesn't intervene. So often as husbands and fathers, we don't intervene, right? We are responsible for the abuse because we don't do anything about it. And you know what? The parent in the home who doesn't commit the abuse is just as guilty if they don't take those children out of that home. Those who don't do anything about it are just as guilty in the eyes of God. Abraham can't say, well, I'm not the one disrespecting you. Well, I'm not the one abusing you. Yes, but you are the man in a man-centered culture, and you have more power than anyone else, and you look the other way, and you get busy with your hobbies in the backyard. I'm assuming he has a backyard. Because it's less painful that way. Abraham goes on to sever his relationship with Hagar. He gives her right back. He severs the relationship. She's not my concubine anymore. She's your slave. You take her. You do what you want to. He basically says, if you want to abuse her, she's yours to abuse. How cruel. And he never confronts Hagar in love. He never gently confronts Sarah, and he never confronts Ishmael for mocking. He never protects Ishmael either. You know, confronting itself is a way to protect others. Because if we call them out lovingly on their stuff, think of what we protect them from down the road. If Abraham had loved Sarah and Hagar and eventually even Ishmael enough to tell them the truth in love with gentleness and compassion, he would have saved that whole family from a multitude of sins. We think of confronting others as meanness. That's love. To gently call someone out kindly is a gift that protects everybody. But he does nothing. I think God was inviting him to empathize with his wife, grieve her infertility and his. What compassion he would have had for everyone in the story had he just been in touch with his grief. And maybe he would have trusted God, the God of heaven, enough to put himself at the mercy of God. Maybe he would have consulted God. He never apologizes. He never confronts. I don't think he recognizes any more than anyone else in the story how his story and the message he's heard about himself impacts what he's doing and not doing today. So he sends off his son. He sends off his son's mom with almost nothing to protect them. They almost starved to death. I suspect, don't you, that Abraham became numb. Don't you have to become numb to just tell your teenage son, whom you love with all your heart, this is goodbye? And you just move on. How do you do that? I have friends that are in the police force or the military or work in hospitals, and they tell me it's really hard not to just go numb because it's easier to do their job that way. Abraham's passivity destroyed his family. Boy, what a message here. This isn't a sermon, okay? I don't have points and poems. But I'll tell you what, I don't want to live my life like these characters. I want to have the courage to, rather than passivity and numbness, to move forward in compassion, to tell people how I feel, to tell them how I'm experiencing them, to gently confront them in love so that we all win. But I have to die to something, don't I? If I do that. The only question is, what do you have to die to? Sarah and Hagar and Abraham all had to die to something different. But any one of them could have changed the story. Let's pray. Father, I don't know the solution to the relationships in my life, but I know that you're inviting me to grieve what's going on inside my heart before you, to empathize with the people around me and to imagine what it's like for them, to own my own mistakes, to ask for forgiveness, to live differently when I realize I've really messed up. Father, I pray that you would give us all courage to live like that, so that our stories have a different ending. And we pray this in Jesus' name.